At best, limited utility. These technologies have seen a huge surge in investments over this past term. In this webinar, we'll give a more detailed overview of what these technologies are, see what advocates across the country are doing to fight against these technologies, and give you, the audience, a chance to ask our panel of experts your questions. To start with, we'll have 5 presentations, after which we'll ask a few predetermined questions, and then we'll open up the floor to you all to ask your own questions. Before passing the mic to our first presenter, I'd like to give a brief plug for a rally that we're having on November 16th in East Chicago against Dirty Hydrogen. We'd love for many people to show up as possible, so please visit this link that I'm dropping in the chat for more information. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our first speaker, Manuel, our Federal Research Manager here at We Act for Environmental Justice.
Thanks, Yosef. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I know it's not that easy to join a webinar late on a Tuesday afternoon, but I'm really happy you're here. I'm going to talk a little bit about false solutions, mainly hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, CCS. This is a subject that we could talk about for hours and really get in depth and wonky and spend a lot of time talking. But what I'm going to try to do is to give you some, very basics and talk, kind of set the stage a little bit for the panelists that we have coming up. And so to give you a little bit of false solutions 101, I just want to introduce you to both hydrogen and CCS. And hydrogen, is the lightest element usually found as a gas. The reason that some people are excited about it currently is it can serve as an energy source / storage. It does this through either combustion, so burning it the same way you do natural gas, and it can also be used in what are known as fuel cells, which are essentially chemical batteries. And the reason that people are excited about it are because when you burn it, you don't get any CO2 release. So you're able to use it like natural gas, but you don't get any CO2 emissions or any greenhouse gas emissions the way you do with fossil fuels. When you use it in fuel cells, the only byproduct is water. It's not found in large reservoirs naturally. It's not like something we can mine or extract from the ground. We have to actually extract it from other places, such as natural gas or water, and that's an incredibly energy-intensive process. If you're familiar at all with hydrogen, you've probably been bombarded with various color schemes. So just to give you a few highlights of what some of those colors mean, gray hydrogen is hydrogen that's produced from natural gas. This is most of the current natural gas production, hydrogen production in the United States. Blue is like gray, except that you remove all of the CO2 emissions with CCS. And then green is hydrogen that is created by using an electrolyzer, which runs electricity through water to separate the hydrogen from the oxygen. And pink is the same as green, but it involves energy that is produced from nuclear power. Carbon capture and storage, or CCS, involves the removal of CO2 from emissions at a point source. So, something like a power plant or a hydrogen production facility, as in the case of blue hydrogen. Once you've extracted the CO2, then it has to be stored. At that point, it involves transport, and it's usually injected deep into the ground through injection wells and kept in geologic storage. Sometimes it's also known as CCUS, where the U stands for utilization, and this is CO2 that is used in the production of further oil and natural gas injection wells. There's also what's known as direct air capture, which doesn't happen at an emissions point source. This is just where CO2 is extracted from the ambient atmosphere. This is much harder and takes a lot more energy because there's not nearly as much CO2 in the ambient atmosphere as there is in the smokestack of a power plant. So that all sounds great, right? But why are we calling it a false solution? So what is exactly a false solution? And a false solution is a technology or process that's marketed as a solution to the climate crisis that either increases pollution burden, expands our reliance on fossil fuels, or increases fossil fuel infrastructure, or exacerbates health risks, especially health risks within environmental justice communities. So are these technologies really false solutions? Yes. CCS simply does not work. Capture rates are usually advertised as very high, around 90%. All the capture rates that we've seen on CCS projects always fall below what's advertised. And that's especially the case when you account for the additional fossil fuels burned to power the CCS equipment. So this is an additional piece of equipment that you're putting on a power plant smokestack. You have to increase energy production for that, and that means that you're going to get further emissions. CCS does nothing to prevent co-pollutants such as NOx, and because you're burning more fossil fuels, it likely increases them. Carbon storage is completely unproven. If you're familiar with any oil and gas infrastructure, you know that it leaks. They can't properly contain methane, then how can they contain hydrogen, which is a much smaller gas and much harder to contain? And frankly, why would anyone trust oil and gas to get this right when they continuously fail us with the current infrastructure they have in place? And then frankly, even if it did work, and even if it was good, CCS perpetuates the use of fossil fuels, and it continues using EJ communities as sacrifice zones. That fact alone should be disqualifying. And so what about hydrogen? First of all, fossil-based hydrogen, much like CCS, continues our reliance on fossil fuels and is neither a climate nor EJ solution in any sense. Hydrogen should never be an option for direct electrification as possible. So if you're in California, you might have seen one of the 2 or 3 hydrogen refueling stations for light-duty vehicles that are available in that state. It's so much simpler and more efficient to simply charge cars with electricity than to use electricity to create hydrogen and then use hydrogen to power cars. Hydrogen should never be used as a substitute for natural gas. So it shouldn't be burned in power plants. It should never be used inside homes. This is just, keeping our reliance on fossil fuels. And so there's a lot of excitement because hydrogen, when burned, it doesn't, emit CO2. But as hydrogen is released into the atmosphere, it causes chemical reactions which then lead to greenhouse gas emissions. And it also still causes NOx emissions. And so these are, co-pollutants that are really harmful in EJ communities. And it's just a continuation of the status quo. I do want to allow for the possibility that there are some uses of green hydrogen, especially when green hydrogen is produced with renewable energy, that might actually help us in a decarbonization process. But what I really want to stress here is that there are limited situations where it's useful, and the possible benefits of using hydrogen correctly are incredibly small when you compare them to the downsides if we get this wrong. There's a huge amount of risk to EJ communities. Where does the water for hydrogen production come from? How do the EJ communities handle the pollution? What about the safety risks? And are we really going to tout something that continues these type of situations in EJ communities and perpetuates them as sacrifice zones as a climate solution? No, that's why we call them false solutions. Unfortunately, there is a large amount of federal money that is currently coming to both of these technologies through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. For hydrogen, there's $7 billion that are allocated for the Department of Energy hubs. That's a lot of money, but it's very small in comparison to the over 100 billion that's estimated to be the cost of the hydrogen production tax credit, which is known as 45B. Then there's also 750 million that's being given out for projects in 24 states. CCS has been around for a while. There was already a tax credit for it known as 45Q. The IRA made that even more potent. The cost for that through 2032 is estimated to be $30 billion. So that's 30 billion in tax credit monies that the IRS is expected to hand out within the next decade. There's also 12.2 billion from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that's coming for carbon capture or CCS. Some of that is for straight carbon capture. Some of that is for transport and storage. And that also includes money for direct air capture hubs. This is a large amount of money. This is really influencing how much effort is being funneled into these false solutions when we should be looking for actual solutions to the climate crisis. talk a little bit about the DOE hydrogen hubs. There are 7 hubs throughout the US that were selected. 3 of them have been currently awarded. That's the Appalachian Hub, the California Hydrogen Hub, and the Pacific Northwest. And these are hubs where money is already going out the door. They've reached a level where we're supposed to be getting information back. Unfortunately, the information that we're receiving from the DOE or from these hubs directly is really poor. There is a complete lack of transparency in this whole process. I think you'll hear about that a little bit more from a couple of our panelists that talk about their advocacy around the hubs. And I do want to point out here that the hubs are driving a lot of the conversations on how we think about hydrogen, a lot of the policy around hydrogen, and they're influencing the strength of the 45V tax credit. But the 45V tax credit is a much larger program that's going to end up influencing the end result of how hydrogen plays out in our country, because it's magnitudes larger in the amount of money that's being handed out. I've mentioned the complete lack of transparency. Just to give you an example of how this is playing out, these are 3 screenshots from a technical volume from the California Hydrogen Hub. And so this is a volume that California Hub has put on their website, and they say that they're trying to be transparent and how they are carrying this out. When you redact things, it's the opposite of transparency. And I am not kidding when you can look through large segments of this and you are just page after page after page of black lines where we're not able to see what's happening. And these aren't, some really irrelevant trade secrets or technical processes. These are the places where we're trying to figure out where these hubs are going, what communities are going to be placed in, what the impacts are. And so this is completely unacceptable. I think you'll hear Martha talk about that a little bit, and Brooke as well. This is just something that's incredibly frustrating in our fight against these hubs. We don't know what they are, we don't know where they're going, and we don't know what they're totally encompassing. I also want to highlight that the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council recently released a set of comments around carbon management. I highly encourage everyone to go give them a read. Just to give you some top line takeaways, they mentioned that the EPA should suspend issuance of Class 6 permits. I think Monique might talk a little bit about these wells or Jane and how they're impacting and how they're turning out not to be safe. It also says that DOE should suspend the use of community benefits agreements and plans until all the risks and impacts of hydrogen hubs are fully disclosed to the public. Right. So I just showed you how we don't know what the risks are because we don't know where the facilities are. We don't know what the emissions are. We don't know pretty much anything about these hubs except that money is going out the door and what the states that they're going to be located in. And so we can't really have community benefits agreements in place or plans because we don't know what the communities are getting. So how are we supposed to understand what our tax money is going to fund and whether or not it's in our interests or not? Highly encourage you to go give those a read. They're excellent. I think they have a lot of great information within them. And so there are 2 points that I want to finish on really quickly here, just to drive home that if we know that these are false solutions, why is there so much federal money going to them, and why is there so much excitement over them? Well, first and foremost, hydrogen and CCS are incredibly potent greenwashing tools, right? You can advertise them as clean energy. You can say that they're, a way that ExxonMobil is another chapter in lowering emissions. In truth, they're a way to monetize a natural gas resource that is quickly losing value as people are realizing that we need to move away from fossil fuels. CCS is the same thing. It's a way for them to keep producing fossil fuels, to keep burning them, to keep that market going, and say that we're removing the CO2 and so we're addressing climate change. We can have it all, right? We can continue burning these fuels and we can live in a future safe from climate change, and it's just not the case. Additionally, I also want you to understand that CCS and hydrogen are experiments that are occurring currently within EJ communities, and they are experiments that are occurring without the consent of these communities, and without the communities being given the ability to say no. Recently, there's been a lot of news about the first injection wells that have been permitted being found to have leaks. The steel that is going into all of these wells is not appropriate for this method, and it's prone to leaking, it's prone to corrosion. It's just not a material that's suitable. And this is just one example of how all of these projects are being undertaken without a complete understanding of how they will play out and what the effects will be on the communities that they are occurring in. These are experiments. This is something that violates the fundamental principles of environmental justice, and it's something that we really need to stop. And so I'm gonna toss it back to Yosef so we can get to our great panelists. I know that was really quickly, and it's not a very deep look, but I just wanted to give you some foundational experience, some foundational information so that our panelists can go into more detail about their experiences with hydrogen CCS.
Thanks, Benny. And yeah, really appreciate that brief overview of two very complicated topics. And yeah, I would now like to pass it over to Brooke, Director of Policy at the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance.
Thanks, Yosef. Just wanted to flag I'm not able to turn on my video. There's a bit of a host has stopped it. So I'll get started hopefully while we're able to adjust that. So hi folks, my name is Brooke Helmick and I serve as the Director of Policy with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. We are a 22-year-old organization and the only statewide, environmental justice organization in New Jersey. So since our inception, our work has largely focused on air pollution, not just greenhouse gases, but co-pollutants like NOx, SOx, and particulate matter, as well as advocating for cumulative impacts analysis, which asks us to look at the emissions, not just from a single facility, but the total emissions from all facilities in a particular area. Because we know that a community surrounded by industry has to breathe in the air of all of the emissions from all of the facilities. And a large part of our work recently has been combating the proliferation of hydrogen fuel, and that's popping up in a number of areas, whether that's the energy and the power sector or the goods movement. In New Jersey, we're seeing a lot of greenwashing, like Manny was talking about, when it comes to hydrogen. So when we're talking about that, our concerns really extend through the whole life cycle of hydrogen. That's production, transportation, storage, and usage. And usage in particular is concerning because when we're thinking about co-pollutants, because hydrogen co-firing, according to one study, can produce as much as 6 times as much NOx as natural gas combustion. So we've done a lot of work on this. I do want to uplift a white paper that NJEJA has co-written with the Tishman Environment and Design Center, the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy, and the King University Center for the Urban Environment, which highlights all of our concerns around carbon capture and hydrogen. And we put together is a summary of evidence of threats posed by CCS and hydrogen co-firing, and it's pretty jarring. And synthesizing data on equity and public health and environmental risks, all while taking into consideration the poor track record of this technology and the questionable efficacy rates, what we're seeing is the potential for a double burden. And by this, I mean EJ communities who are already at risk of climate disaster are not only navigating the risk of these technologies, are navigating now the risk of these technologies, which is proclaiming to mitigate climate change. So we're seeing this double burden. And a lot of that research and learned knowledge from our partners has supported our work at the state and the federal level. So I want to zero in for a moment on Mach 2. As was described, Mach 2 is part of the regional hydrogen hubs and is the hub that will affect New Jersey as well as parts of eastern Pennsylvania and Delaware. And there's 3 main pieces I want to raise when we're talking about Mach 2, which is first the lack of transparency and information. NJEJA alone, as well as a bunch of other organizations that I know have been advocating to oppose the hub, we have put in at least 3 separate instances of questions via email, as well as questions on our website. And we've made this really transparent and publicly accessible in an effort to initiate dialogue and conversation. But we've gotten very little information about where or how hydrogen will be used in this project. We've gotten no information about alternatives explored, risks, uses, transportations. We haven't even been given something as simple as how this hydrogen will be moved. So, we have a lot of questions about pipelines and supercooled trucks and how these things are going to be stored, where it's going to be used, who's going to be affected. And it makes conversation and educating our communities really difficult when we don't even know this basic information. A secondary piece to that is that the Mach 2 program has instituted what they're calling the Mach 2 membership plan, which is asking folks to pay for information and access to conversations. And on their website, it's actually described as an initiative, as a new forum to convene, connect, and engage with other members of the clean energy ecosystem. But by instituting a paywall, they're effectively cutting communities out of this conversation. And the third piece I want to bring in here is really just a total lack of community consent that we're seeing. There has not been two-way engagement. There has not been opportunity to provide feedback on proposals. There hasn't been a mention of a right of refusal of infrastructure. And I think that's really summed up by the 2 virtual community listening sessions that were held for folks in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware who are interested in getting involved in conversation on the Mach 2 Hub. There was at least a couple dozen speakers at each listening session. And from what I could tell, all of the speakers at the first event were different than the individuals at the second, and almost every single speaker was either outright opposed to the hub or had serious concerns and questions. And the only public response was a document that the Mach 2 team created, summarizing all of our concerns and then providing just a couple pages of response in aggregation. This is not meaningful engagement. This is not honoring a right of refusal or honoring community consent. The other side that we're seeing is hydrogen popping up in the state level. So we're seeing an increase in hydrogen being referenced in bills. We're seeing it at the regional level, not just coming from the federal level. A few bills in New Jersey have been including hydrogen, and most recently, our Board of Public Utilities Energy Master Plan put out a request for comment and explicitly had a question about how the state should incorporate, quote, emerging and existing technologies, and they mentioned clean hydrogen. And that's really concerning to us, and I think it's important for just a couple of reasons. First, it speaks to how decisions at the federal level really do impact regional work, state legislation, and regulation and work at the local level. And I think it also speaks to a need for more dialogue about what these terms mean. What does green hydrogen? Why are there so many colors? That's a lot of work that needs to be done to educate community members on the latest trends and to combat this greenwashing that we're seeing. And also on this topic, to reframe a bit, to recognize that we need solutions that not only address climate change and carbon emissions, but also address local air pollution and the greenhouse gas co-pollutants like NOx that bring a number of negative health outcomes for communities and environmental justice communities and individuals who breathe this polluted air. So I think that's part of why, to kind of sum it all up, having a space like this, having toolkits and resources and physical media where we can have dialogue about the issues we're facing is really, really important, because we can start to see how these trends are popping up at all levels of governance and come together to share this information and to understand what's being proposed for environmental justice communities across the country. So that's really all I have to share. I will pass it back to Yosef to move us on.
Thank you for that, Brooke. Yeah, so our next speaker is Marta, Executive Director from Physicians for Responsibility.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm in LA and it's still afternoon. So I'm the Executive Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles, and I've been working on climate and environmental justice policy for a very long time, and have been part of California's climate, I'm tired today of trying to move the California Air Resources Board to a better place. And it's not been an easy task. And I do have a slideshow and to share some of, let me figure out how to, there we go. So we have been trying to figure out how to move California's climate policy toward a stronger environmental justice focus, and not doing very good at that. The California Air Resources Board is deeply committed to its climate direction. And so whatever else anyone else in the country thinks, California is completely captured by the fossil fuel industry. The solutions that they're coming up with continue to privilege the fossil fuel industry. And, this is what the landscape, this is from Lawrence Livermore, from Stanford, and Lawrence Livermore are both very much engaged in pushing the science around carbon capture and sequestration, that we can actually meet our climate goals, but only if you just talk about carbon. So I'm going to say this a lot today because I'm obsessed with this idea. Said it to a bunch of green chemists earlier. Stop commodifying carbon. If we stop commodifying carbon, we can actually focus on real emissions reductions. What we say in California is that carbon is the co-pollutant, but that is falling on deaf ears. These are all the proposed projects that are targeting California. If you were to overlay this with the CalEnviro screen, which is our vulnerability index, you would find that all of this area here that's in green is the Central Valley, are some of the most polluted communities in the entire state of California, some of the worst air quality in the entire nation. And this is where the existing fossil fuel infrastructure is. And in Kern, one of the largest oil producing areas in the state of California, where we're still drilling next to where people live, work, and play. And so I call California's climate policy a shitstorm. And here are the things that it's bringing us, and they're all deeply related. So the Global Warming Solutions Act, which creates a cap and trade incentive program that pays people to sort of pollute less. The low carbon fuel standard, which is really important. It's driving a lot of bad policy choices, including hydrogen. So when dairy farmers make more money from selling the methane that comes out of their cows to produce hydrogen, so now they're making money off the dairies and off the milk production, and they're now selling their waste to produce hydrogen. And no matter what anybody says about green hydrogen, that's just a way of making us feel like, oh, maybe there's a good way and we should consider this technology. That isn't how it's going to be made for the foreseeable future. And the dairy industry and the so-called renewable natural gas industry has come to our Environmental Justice Advisory Committee and told us that they will not have stranded assets because they are going to be making so-called renewable natural gas out of cow manure for the foreseeable future. And that is, so there's a whole package of policies that are driving both carbon capture and sequestration, and the hydrogen rainbow, because it's the only way to meet your net zero goals, right? There are accounting tricks to say that we've captured this amount of carbon and that we're actually meeting our goals. And as we'll hear today, this is a national threat. This is where the other threats of this technology are emerging. And and again, this was 2 years ago. It will be much more legislation. As you can see, there's many pro-CCUS bills. One guardrails bill that got smushed together with SB 905. And now, communities kept saying, well, we need guardrails, so we need to be at the table and we should figure something out. And so communities came up with guardrails, but they were quickly ignored. And while SB 905 was passed, that regulatory process is behind actual efforts to get for permits. So this was a project in Mendota. When folks started to ask questions, they voluntarily pulled their permit because they weren't ready. But I would imagine this is going to be another zombie plant that will come back. These are some of, and I hope nobody gets offended by my joke, but this is how we feel in California. Someone's pissing on our head and telling us it's raining. And here's some of the health impacts. Blue hydrogen production made from natural gas, clearly methane, which affects lungs and climate change. CO2 leaks can create leads to more climate change and more health impacts. If enough of these leaks, if the CO2 in particular is an asphyxiant. And so if you're talking about hydrogen pipelines, this is really serious, right? Because if you're from an environmental justice community, the very idea of guardrails is laughable. We are not doing basic things like getting consent from people. And yet we're supposed to trust that the very agencies and the very industries that have brought us the climate change crisis are going to solve the problems, and this time do it in a way that doesn't harm our communities. So it stretches our ability to believe. And there's also land impacts of both green hydrogen and the entire hydrogen rainbow As you can see, pink is one of my favorite colors, and I will not let them ruin pink by calling, how is that possible? That we're going to make hydrogen out of nuclear energy and then say simple things like, well, we'll figure out the waste problem. Well, we haven't figured out the waste problem. And one of the things that our organization knows deeply is we started as an anti-nuclear weapons organization, and we understand that that waste is around for thousands of years. Somebody has to safeguard it, and we don't do well with long-term storage, long-term monitoring. And so what makes us believe that somehow magically now these industries are going to do it the right way? And again, one of the things that we are not taking into consideration, and in California, we have a drought. So the idea of using water, whether it's reclaimed water or whatever that water is, for hydrogen is highly questionable about its sustainability. Most of this research that we're waiting to be published, that most of the estimates of how much water is going to be used are severely undercounted. And somebody should tell me when I have time, because I'm not looking at the screen. So just tell me, Martha, you're running out of time. So again, you're right. I'm going to go through quickly. So I'm going to talk about hydrogen. So the hydrogen, the SoCal Link, we tried to enter into conversations with them, and they just said, oh, this is just an exploratory thing. Don't worry. We don't think we're going to get the grant. And then they got the Arches project. And it's, this is how they want to use hydrogen. They want, through the Arches, they want to use it for transportation. The thing that they've been selling the green hydrogen is, well, you've got the ports, and it's the only way to electrify, to clean up the energy sources at those biggest polluting sources like the ports. So again, we've had to very quickly, learn about the issue, understand the health impacts, but also get communities ready to stop a moving train, right? And we do that by both, organizing, learning the facts, but most important, by changing the terms of the debate. And so what we've been doing is really talking about who is behind the projects, who are the companies that are driving the train. And in California, when I say California captured, the head of the Hydrogen Coalition used to work at the California Air Resources Board. Many former Air Resources Board executive officers and high-level staff have gone into work either in the natural gas industry or hydrogen industry, or promoting carbon capture and sequestration. So our agency that's supposed to be giving us guardrails is completely ineffective in actually doing what we need. And we know that the reason that carbon capture exists is to produce more oil. This is from their website. Goal number one, produce more domestic oil. These are the companies that are bringing you carbon capture. And this is probably not all of them, but it's also important to see who are the nonprofits who are supporting. And this is probably not a full list of who is supporting carbon capture from the nonprofit side. And again, these are some of the research institutions that are supporting CCUS and pro-CCUS research. And, those of us who've worked on nukes and have a particular disrespect for Lawrence Livermore National Labs, because they were also proponents of nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And then labor support, which is one of the biggest challenges, the promise of jobs. And we need to, really break down what that means. So recently in Kern County, they've issued one of the county voted to approve the project. Labor was out in force, communities were out in force. And even though folks had real issues around the safety, what won the day was this jobs argument. And there are not many permanent jobs. They are the construction jobs to fill the facility, but very few permanent jobs. And this is where I think we really have to do some work in power building and organizing that about, should we be building these? Again, this is another network map to show you where the money is coming from, aside from the money lots of money that they've gotten from the government. And then what we have been doing for a while now in California is really growing the resistance by working together across organizations, bringing together coalitions and alliances. We're trying to launch now health professionals. We're trying to figure out the name, but it's Health Professionals Right Now Against False Solutions. We hope we might change the name to something positive. But again, bringing that, what PSR does is bringing that voice of health professionals together with community voices to fight back on these false solutions that will not get us to where we need to be. So thanks.
Thank you for that, Marta. Yeah, from Jersey to California, it's just awesome having our speakers. So our next speaker is Monique, who's the Director of Law and Policy and Community Engagement Program Manager at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. And I'll pass it over to you, Monique.
Thank you, Yosef. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet. Yes.
Okay. Let's just do one more thing. So I just want to do a deep dive on what we're calling CCS, or what they're calling CCS and we're having to deal with, which stands for Carbon Capture and Storage. So the question for my presentation I'm aiming to answer is, what is CCS and why should I be concerned? So getting the name straight, CCS stands for Carbon Capture and Storage. You might also see, instead of the word storage, sequestration being used. Under any name, whether storage or sequestration, the capturing of the carbon and how it would be disposed, all involve a very risky industrial process. And this process is really being targeted at vulnerable environmental justice communities. In Louisiana, there's a proposed project in a community that's overrun with toxic pollution. Plans for using explosives to be able to figure out the amount of pore space under a lake that might be available for storing carbon dioxide. And people are fighting against it, bringing it to their city councils and town councils and permitting agencies that they don't want this danger where they live. And for many of our environmental justice communities, it's a danger that has a multiplier effect. This comes at a time in Louisiana where we are certainly hit by climate crisis and very vulnerable to it. And folks are really looking for solutions that get us away from dirty energy, the burning of oil, gas, and coal, fossil fuels, and moving us towards a renewable energy economy that is centered around equity and the restoration of communities and livelihoods harmed by dirty energy. So in breaking down carbon capture storage, it's important not to overlook what is carbon dioxide. And what brings us to this space is the way in which carbon dioxide, once it's released into the atmosphere from industrial smokestacks and vehicle tailpipes, it moves upwards into the atmosphere where it traps heat on the planet, inducing planetary warming and horrific disasters that we're now experiencing. But carbon dioxide is also defined as a hazardous waste under our federal environmental law called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. You might also hear it called by its initials, RCRA, but they don't say that, they call it RCRA. So RCRA, or Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, is our federal law that regulates and sets protections against hazardous waste, of which carbon dioxide is one. What makes it a hazardous waste under this law is that it's corrosive. It can break down metals and rock formations. This is critical to know in terms of understanding what is brought with an idea around carbon capture and storage. It's exposing underground rock formations to millions and millions of tons of a corrosive hazardous waste, which is carbon dioxide collected from the waste streams at industrial facilities. It's also transporting millions and millions of tons of this carbon dioxide via metal pipelines. So the potential for leaks in those pipelines are present. They don't go away because the source is carbon dioxide and its nature is to break down metals and rock formations. In addition to that, carbon dioxide, enough of it can displace oxygen in the air we need to breathe. It's also oxygen that ICE engine, vehicles, trucks, and the like, ambulances, all need to be able to move. And so when you have enough carbon dioxide that spills out of a pipeline, you've cut off oxygen, which means that asphyxiation, suffocation is the present threat, and the ability to escape from it in a regular vehicle that uses gas is cut off. And then when you're looking at those rock formations where carbon dioxide might be injected underground, if they're near fault lines, that can really trigger earthquake, seismic activity above ground, causing things to shift above ground. So wherever you look at industrial releases of carbon dioxide, you see that it's dangerous wherever it goes. So why not focus on not burning the stuff that generates or produces carbon dioxide? That's where we should be headed, as opposed to more burning and you know, with concepts of a plan for capturing the carbon dioxide, if I could use that phrasing in this election season. So CCS involves a three-step process. Step one is collecting it from the waste stream at an industrial facility, and then building out millions of miles of pipeline across states to move that carbon dioxide to spaces where sites have been permitted for the underground injection. Again, those metal pipelines are subject to corrosion by the CO2 that's traveling through them. And then the injection underground. If all goes well, it won't create problems, but what we know is that the risks are that it won't go well because carbon dioxide is a very dynamic material. It does move. Obviously, it moves, if given the opportunity, it moves upwards, as we know, when it is released from you know, in large amounts, it moves up into the atmosphere where it traps heat. Same thing happens when it's underground. It's seeking to move. And so the migration of carbon dioxide is a problem that industries have not been able to figure out. And so the risks of rock formation breakdown, the risks of pipelines, wells in the area, being able to draw that carbon dioxide through those wells really entirely defeats the purpose for carbon capture and storage, because guess what? Once it moves up through the well, it's now available to move into the atmosphere. And so the risks are present with each step of the process. It's not just the storage where there's risk, it's in the pipeline transport, and it's in the collection from an industrial site, which right now has no regulation on how that carbon dioxide can be collected in a way that does not draw in other toxic and hazardous waste that's in the flue stream. So back in 2014, the Environmental Protection Agency issued a decision that waives that RCRA protections from carbon dioxide for the purpose of deploying carbon capture storage projects in the United States. And a look at certain aspects of what well injection, how it would be regulated as a hazardous waste versus how it's currently regulated without the requirements for hazardous waste under RCRA. You see that when it comes to siting requirements for a hazardous well in terms of, you know, the zone, the protective layers away from groundwater, wherever you look at it, however you slice it, you see that requirements for wells that where hazardous waste is injected do not apply to the injection of carbon dioxide under new rules that have been promulgated without the protections of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. The same thing goes in terms of the sharp contrasts between requirements for wells that are for hazardous waste versus those for carbon dioxide. That same sharp contrast exists when you're looking at well construction. So the level of protections that would otherwise be required if carbon dioxide was regulated as a hazardous waste, which is what it is right now, until it was waived by EPA, removes protections from communities and our environment. One of the things that we were very interested in at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice was figuring out whether or not EPA's decision to waive RCRA requirements from CO2, carbon dioxide in the carbon capture storage process, whether any of that was justified by any testing or environmental assessments conducted by the Environmental Protection Agency. So we filed a Freedom of Information Act request with EPA, and we asked for all records related to the sampling or testing of carbon dioxide stream captured from an industrial emission source, including all documents indicating the result of such sampling or testing. And after a number of meetings with EPA personnel, it ended with their acknowledging that they had never conducted any environmental test or assessment, and then they put that in writing in their response to our FOIA request, reading, EPA has no agency records in response to this request, indicating that it was never done by the agency. So we have the removal of a federal protection to make way for carbon capture storage. We have this removal being without any justification in terms of scientific analysis or testing or assessment. And this is something that we should be all, supporting, celebrating. It makes no sense. I've never seen anything like this in my years of work on environmental justice and environmental protection. So what's driving this carbon capture storage? Lots and lots of money, American taxpayer money, in fact. So the IRS tax code, section 45Q, was put together by, passed through our Congress, signed by the president, that provides $85 for every metric ton of carbon dioxide that is set for underground disposal, as a underground disposal. Projects that we are aware of that are planning to inject carbon dioxide underground are, planning at the very least 1 million tons. So that's 85 million tons. There's an Exxon project that's 500 million tons. That's $500 million, all paid for by American taxpayers. Not one shareholder of any of these companies is putting 1 penny in this effort. In addition to the the very, excessive tax credit that's given to incentivize carbon capture storage, there's also federal grants handed out by the Department of Energy, federal U.S. Department of Energy, that was issuing $2.5 billion for carbon capture projects proposed by industries. And so look at those industries that are seeking applications for carbon capture storage in terms of waste injection, and the permitting of those underground waste injection wells shows that as of last year, about this time, there were 58 applications pending with the Environmental Protection Agency. Those applications included multiple wells totaling 169 in 12 states that you see on the map colored in red. The majority of these applications and wells are targeting Louisiana, where I live, in New Orleans. And that the time period from application submission to potentially application granted, EPA estimates to be about a 2-year period, which varies application to application on a case-by-case basis.
Sorry, real quick, Monique, if you could wrap up in like the next
Yeah,
minute.
this is my last slide.
Okay, sorry.
So one of the, notwithstanding how overwhelming this all might appear, local action is a critical way in which we can fight back on this. And I wanted to share with you examples that that we took here at Deep South Center for Environmental Justice with, briefing our city council, which is, our local legislative body, on carbon capture storage, and the council taking action to actually prohibit the deployment of carbon capture storage anywhere within the city of New Orleans. A few months later, something similar was done in Livingston Parish, imposing a moratorium on injection wells for carbon dioxide. So the opportunity for local action is available and important to pursue. And in some ways, it's where residents, concerned residents, have the most influence over decision making that takes place where they live. And with that, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Monique. And yeah, I'd like to just kick it over to our last presenter, Jane.
Sure.
Jane, sorry, the Economy Campaign Manager at the Center for International Environmental Law.
Yeah, thanks, Yosef. So, as Yosef said, I'm from the Center for International Environmental Law. I'm also from Louisiana. I'm a lifelong resident of South Louisiana. It's the only place I have ever lived or called home. All of my 4 siblings live within an hour of me. And this work is very personal for me in exactly the way that it's very personal for everyone who has been on this panel, because we are living in places that are being targeted for this build out. I just want to shine light on a couple of things that have already been said by the panelists who came before me, just to really drive those points home, which is that this is not just a technology that we know does not work. And it is not just a technology that, it does not work to address climate concerns. It does not reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. It also is not only a technology that is harmful to all of the communities that are anywhere near where the stuff is being planned to be captured, transported, or injected, as previous speakers have said. This build out, it is also a build out that is moving so fast and is so well funded that we are having trouble keeping track of all of the new projects that are coming up, in addition to the information to the issue of information being available that Manny touched on in his opening slides. New projects announced every week, not just new carbon capture and not just new carbon injection, but new carbon emitters. Y'all, they're talking about using this massive build out of new pipelines and injection wells to justify the construction of new emitters, not to address the amount of carbon that is already in the atmosphere. The world's premier climate scientists have made it clear. This is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that is feeding into the climate treaty negotiation process. This panel of hundreds of the world's premier climate scientists have made it clear that our best option, our best pathway for preventing catastrophic loss of life from climate change is a fast, funded, and fair fossil fuel phase out. We need to get off of fossil fuels. This entire build out is actually about using carbon capture and storage to essentially launder methane into hydrogen and ammonia, which are billed as clean burning fuels. This is all part of the net zero calculation. And what that calculation fails to take into account is all of the emissions, all of the risk, the harm, the air pollution, the carbon emissions, the carbon management that is being offloaded onto the communities that live alongside these facilities, as all of my previous co-panelists have very expertly laid out. In the face of such a fast and what has felt a predatory build out of these facilities all over the country. CIEL's main role, that's my organization, the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, we say CIEL. Our main role has actually been to bring people together and to facilitate joint strategies and joint conversations for how we push back on this build out, and particularly how we push back on the government. One of the questions I believe in the Q&A was about these big greens and how they're supporting carbon capture and storage. That was actually how we got our start in this, was realizing that there was a lot of support for this dangerous, misleading, false solution technology, a lot of support among big greens, and we pushed back and were rallying other NGOs. All the groups represented on this call, I think, are groups who didn't need to be rallied, who were in and against this from the very beginning. But some of those other NGOs who have given cover and pass to the Inflation Reduction Act, to the bipartisan infrastructure bill that is making, or the law that is making all of this build out possible, those NGOs are still dug in. They're still giving cover to this technology. And y'all, I get it. I understand why we want to believe that this technology works. I understand why we want to believe that we don't have to change dramatically our lives or our economy in order to prevent climate damage, but it's just not accurate. We will have to change dramatically the way our economy is built, and we will have to change the way we work and the way we live in order to prevent catastrophic damage and loss of life. And I am excited about the innovation and the possibility to be found in that future. Not really excited about the amount of work and organizing that we have to do to stop this build out right now. I want to share a couple of resources with you guys that CIEL has put together, and then I want to talk very briefly about the Louisiana Against False Solutions Coalition. These are just a couple of pages from CIEL's website and a couple of reports that we've put out. My first foray into understanding what was happening with not just carbon capture and storage, but also other technologies that are billed as geoengineering. So solar remediation management, direct air capture, all of these efforts and technologies to try to change the earth or capture the emissions or change the way the earth's systems function in order to avoid having to get off of fossil fuels. That was covered in a report that CIEL put out in 2019 called the Fuel to the Fire report. And that report, combined with the speed and the urgency with which this build out is being pushed by the federal government into my community and others, is why I got into this work. This actually wasn't what I was originally working on for CIEL. I was working on plastics and petrochemicals. And as CCS became more and more of a threat, I got more engaged in this fight because I'm from Louisiana and I want to be able, I was born in Louisiana, God willing, I want to die in Louisiana, not soon, but at the end of my life. And I want to make sure that this state has a livable future and that they're not just turning it into unlivable Swiss cheese with all these carbon wells. And so that is how I got managed to move over within CIEL to work on this issue. And a lot of what we are doing is bringing people together. We're facilitating NGO conversation and strategy. We're facilitating legal and legislative conversation and strategy. And we work with the Louisiana Against False Solutions Coalition, and we're a founding member of Louisiana Against False Solution, which is a coalition of more than 20 organizations across the state of Louisiana that are pushing back against this build out. There is a similar coalition built up in Texas. You also heard about California and about New Jersey and all of the coalitions that have had to be built up, all of the work that we've had to do in order to protect our communities. This is one of the worst kinds of threats. It is a threat, it is a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is being pushed by people who consider themselves our allies. It is being pushed onto us, and we are being treated like we are not smart. We are being treated like we are opposed to solutions. We are being treated like we don't care about the climate and accused of that because we are pushing back on this dangerous false solution. And I just want to shine one final light and then hand it back over to Yosef to say, I'm hearing in Brooke's experiences and Marta's experiences and Monique's experiences, and I know from my own experience, the engagement that the federal government has had with communities, that the Department of Energy, that the EPA has had with communities, that is where I use the word predatory. It has been very quick, we checked a box, we had a conversation, no questions have been answered. There's no go, no go decision that communities are being granted. There's nothing. The White House has put together its own Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, which just a few days ago put out their recommendations against carbon management because of how dangerous it is. And they've been speaking out against it for almost the entire existence of the WEJAC, of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And the White House has been ignoring them and actually unhappy with them that they are coming out against what the White House, the Democratic Party, is pushing as the solution. At the end of the day, the Inflation Reduction Act is only a climate bill. It's only a climate law if you believe that carbon capture and storage works. And not only does it not work, it is extremely dangerous and it is antithetical to environmental justice principles. And frankly, our federal government right now is not living up to their promises and obligations of environmental justice by ignoring their own advisors, by ignoring the public, and by not providing information. And I want to be clear that the solution to this problem, the problem of climate change, is a fast-funded, fair fossil fuel phase-out, period. That is what we need to be organizing around. That is what needs to be funded, not a carbon capture scam shell game by the oil and gas industry. And I just want to close by saying these wells are leaking, the existing carbon wells that they've already drilled, and there's only 2 of them in the whole dang country. This is an experiment, as someone else said earlier. Those wells are leaking. The companies that are billed as successes, it turns out they're misreporting the data we found coming out of Norway today. They haven't stored nearly as much carbon dioxide as they said they have. And the government is fundamentally not acting in good faith. And it is not protecting our communities, and it is not providing us with real solutions. And that's what I think all of us are here today to talk about, and are working day in and day out, is for our government to do what it is telling us it is doing. Because, to borrow a phrase from Marta, you can't piss on me and tell me it's raining. And that is exactly what the government is doing. So with that, I will hand it back to Yosef. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So we're running a bit over, so we'll skip the moderated Q&A and just go straight to audience questions for a couple minutes. Sorry about that, folks. But to just ask the panel the first question, which Jane already touched on a little bit, how do we counter the authority of Ivy League schools and other respectable environmental organizations in conversations with our friends and family?
I can just quickly jump in just for time. I will say that I've become real fun at parties lately, as Manny and others can attest. Talking about carbon capture and storage every time someone puts a glass of wine in your hand, probably not the best way to get invited back, but it is actually something that people need to know. And I will say that the vast majority of people who are going to be harmed and affected by this have absolutely no idea that it is happening. There are so few people who have any idea. But the minute you start to tell them about it, the minute you tell them what's going on, the minute you talk about CO2 as an asphyxiant, as a corrosive thing, as the oil and gas industry's waste product that they're being paid to manage, the minute you bring it up, people are against it. They're outraged. They want to know more. They want to show up to a meeting. And I think that's what we've got to keep talking about, and what we've got to keep bringing to this is like, now's not the time to be fun at parties, right? Or be fun after we've talked about carbon capture and people have said they're going to show up for a meeting. I think that's what I'm taking away from this.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, do any of our other panelists want to comment on that?
Yeah, there's a couple things that are coming to mind. First is really honoring the knowledge of individuals who have navigated some of these issues, have lived leakages, like to honor their experiences as a valid, worthwhile, centered form of knowledge, I think is really important. And also maybe to look at instances in which folks haven't been taken seriously about technological implementation that has put them at risk. Maybe if it's not CCS or hydrogen, though, I think that there's a pattern of behavior that is also worth examining and worth looking at. And the other piece I would say is when we're talking about climate change in particular, we need to be thinking about how we can integrate policy decisions that address local air pollution while we're addressing climate change. And I think if we wrap up both of those things together, the policy decisions are going to become a lot more clear in what is a good solution and what is a false solution.
So I'll weigh in here. I think that, as a scientist, I always want to make my case with data. And what I found very frustrating in this process is that there are times when we present the data on how these situations are not productive, and it doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't move the needle. And so we essentially have to find a place to focus on something that does move the needle. And I really think where that is focusing on the fact that whether it's hydrogen or CCS, they really do rely on the continuity of EJ communities as sacrifice zones. I think that's a really powerful fact that we need to confront all of the supporters with, especially supporters who profess to be on our side. Marta gave you a list of all the nonprofits and academic organizations who are supporting these programs, not to mention, agencies that are currently headed by a Democratic administration that are pushing a lot of this technology. And these are people who on one hand have done a lot for EJ, and on the other, are selling us down the river with, their support of these technologies. And so I think it's important to just confront people with the fact that when they, push carbon capture or when they push these hydrogen hubs on communities that can't afford to have them, that they're really costing communities of color lives. And we need to be really blunt about that. And we need to point out the cost in public health terms and in human terms. And I think that's really the way to make things resonate, because when we focus on arguments that center around, emissions and other data points that are normally used in the climate advocacy, I haven't seen those be quite as successful as just pointing out that if you keep pushing this, it's going to be to the detriment of Black and brown lives.
Awesome. And looks like we got two more quick questions left. So Sharon says she agrees with that the community benefits don't apply to this technology. What do you all suggest communities can do?
Well, I mean, I can speak to what some in California we're doing, and then some of the on the ground fights, right? And when we started to see this in 2022, we were like, okay, so what can we do? We don't have a backstop at the state level, and so we knew it would be hand-to-hand combat on the ground, facility by facility, permit by permit, lawsuit by lawsuit. And I think right now those are the tools that we have to stop individual projects. And so, this one that just got approved, we now have to figure out, well, what's our next strategy, while we also try to chip away at sort of the philosophy that's behind continuing to permit these, that somehow we can save, that we don't have to change behavior, that we continue to extract, and somehow it'll be okay. And I think tearing at that narrative, I think somebody asked the question about the IPCC and mixed messages. There's a lot of cherry picking of what IPCC has said about carbon capture and sequestration. And so we should be careful about those cherry picked arguments. And then, we in California actually had an environmental justice scenario, how to get to near zero without these, and we had it, but the agency said, no, it would completely tank the economy and blah, 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 and it would actually be worse for health. And so we're fighting at the level of models. And so when you're fighting at the level of economic models, you're going to need white verifiers. And that is just what has happened to us. We've said things, and then some white researcher said it. And I've had board members say, well, I'm now, I saw this research. And I'm like, well, that's what the environmental justice community has been saying. So I think lifting up that we, you know, the more we know about things, we rarely find that they're safer than we thought, right? And so being able to make the science arguments around the more we study this, the more we realize it's not the solution. But I think you know, being prepared for those deep local fights, right? Using all the tools, whether it's RCRA, whether it's CEQA, whatever tools you have. And it's unfortunate that, but for a while, that's where the fight is going to be while we unravel, you know, actually having a moral budget that isn't spending money on false solutions, right? So there's a lot of organizing levels that have to happen, right? Shift the money because you have to starve the beast. I don't believe in shame, but I think shaming in, you know, academic institutions, because we got calls, right, from Lawrence Livermore people that they were like all hurt by the things that we were saying about them. And I'm like, well, none of it, you're not saying it's untrue. And so I think you know, all of those strategies we need to sort of pull together as we pull together as a national movement to push back on this.
I also think one of the important things that communities can do in response to the very intense pressure that the Department of Energy is putting on communities to negotiate these community benefits agreements is to remind the DOE, not just themselves, because we don't need reminders of this, that our government is asking us to sign a legally binding agreement with an oil and gas company that in many cases is the same company or a child of a spinoff of the same companies that have been harming our communities for generations. Like push back on that very idea that is outrageous that the federal government would not only suggest we do that, but would pressure that we do that. And I think the other thing that we have to do and be part of, as Marta was saying, is organizing at all the levels, is making sure that your community is all talking to each other, because what they are doing with these community benefits agreements right now is dividing communities off from one another. So we have one pocket of the community that is saying, no, this is not okay, we're going to resist this. And another pocket of the community that is saying, oh, if we get money for first responders, or oh, if we get money for local nonprofits, or oh, if we get money for this or that, then we will agree that it's okay. And exactly what Marta's saying, you end up dividing communities along race and income lines. And I think the most important things that people can do is to be aware and to be watching this like a hawk. And I know what I'm asking people to do, because that requires time and resources and energy and knowledge that people don't always have. But I think that's one of the things that we're trying to support and build the capacity for in communities everywhere.
Thank you for that, guys. So the next question is from Lindsay, and she asked, what alternatives should we push for? Solar, wind, hydroelectric? And how do we make sure these projects are equitable and clean? Pretty broad question.
So I can take a quick stab at that, since I work on a lot of energy, and I think the simple fact is that, you know, we have to push for renewables anywhere that we can get them, right? And we have to push for other technologies such as energy storage, like batteries, and put money into research in places where it's not going to line the pockets of fossil fuel companies to continue what we're doing now, right? We can't just continue the status quo. So I think that's first and foremost. Are renewables the answer in every situation the way they're constructed now? No. Could renewables be the answer if we invested properly in our transmission infrastructure, in the grid, modernized our homes, and saved a lot of energy, dramatically changed the way we think about energy and how much energy we use, and our overall strategy of consumption? Then yes, like it's within reach. And so I think that when we try to continue the same paradigm that we've always been in, it's easy for the fossil fuel companies to make the case that, oh, well, we need more energy because we're going to add more cars to the grid when we start electrifying, we're going to do this and that, and we just continually remain in a mindset where we're just consuming more and more and more. And the only way to do that is to keep extracting these resources and keep polluting these communities. And so we kind of need to shift the narrative, and we need to start thinking about things a little bit differently. And so we're not trapped in the same framework that has gotten us to this point to begin with. And so, Yosef, I do want to point out that we're way over time. I really appreciate people being here late. So I'm going to share my screen, which has the information for the rally that Yosef spoke about. And I want to thank everyone for coming to listen. I want to thank all 4 of our excellent panelists. I think you all gave us really interesting things to think about and gave us some really great bits of information. I want to emphasize what Monique said about, acting locally and getting involved with what's happening in your own backyard and remaining active. And yeah, I'll let you close this out, Yosef.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, Manny. Yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Apologies for it running over, but the panel was amazing and so much information on this topic. So we hope you guys got as much out of it as we did. And yeah, have a great night. Link to the rallies in the chat. And yeah, we'll be following up with slides and other materials. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.